She was born not in a palace of jade and gold, but within the austere, disciplined walls of a Manzhou noble household that valued silence more than splendor, and duty more than desire. The Fuca clan was no ordinary lineage. It was one of the most ancient and prestigious Manchu families under the banner system, fiercely loyal to the Eisenjaro imperial line. From the moment the infant girl first opened her eyes to the rigid air of northern China, her path was already etched in ancestral script, not of grandeur, but of service. The girl who would become Empress Xiaoxianchun was known simply as Lady Fuca in her early years. Her father, Li Rongbao, held high military and bureaucratic rank. His life measured in exacting schedules, memoranda, and tributes. Her mother, though seldom remembered by name, was the unseen architect of her daughter's unbending poise and grace. Lady Fuca's childhood was devoid of the play and privilege so common to the imperial wards. Instead, her life was shaped by quiet morning prayers, long afternoons reciting the classics, and evenings spent in the muted presence of elders whose eyes spoke volumes even as their mouths remained closed. Unlike many noble daughters groomed for beauty and charm, she was shaped for responsibility. Her tutors did not encourage flirtation or melody, but the subtleties of court etiquette, the nuances of diplomacy through silence, and the power of gesture. From a young age, Lady Fuca learned that influence in the Manchu aristocracy often came not from speaking but from knowing when not to speak. Her adolescence was a portrait of restraint. While other girls embroidered tapestries of wild peonies and mandarin ducks, her own work was stark branches in winter, frozen rivers, mountains under snow. She saw elegance in stillness, dignity in discipline. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense, not the kind of woman poets would immortalize with moon metaphors. But there was a gravity to her, an unshakable grace that drew attention without asking for it. It was in this quiet elegance that she caught the attention of Bao then Vong Honglich, the fourth son of the Yongjing Emperor and future Qianlong Emperor. Their first encounter was not the stuff of romance or legend. It was a formal occasion, heavy with ritual and propriety. And yet, among the sea of bright silks and painted smiles, he noticed the girl who bowed with perfect posture and a gaze that neither challenged nor submitted but observed. Honglich was no stranger to the machinery of power. Groomed since childhood in the art of ruling, he had learned early that love was a luxury rarely afforded to emperors. But something about Lady Fuca lingered in his thoughts. She did not flatter, did not scheme, did not beg. She simply existed with such controlled presence that she seemed above the petty rivalries of the inner court. And for a young prince trying to chart his future in a world of daggers hidden behind silks, her serenity was a revelation. Their union was arranged with minimal ceremony but maximum precision. Lady Fuca became his primary consort, not merely for her noble lineage, but for her temperament. She was not a storm to be weathered, but the calm center within it. As the prince rose within the imperial hierarchy, she walked beside him. Not ahead, not behind, but beside, always slightly out of the frame, but never out of reach. Their early years together were marked by balance. While Honglich maneuvered through court intrigues and policy battles, Lady Fuca maintained the inner sanctum of his household with a quiet authority that left no room for disorder. Servants feared her disapproval more than any official reprimand. Other consorts and ladies-in-waiting deferred to her not because she demanded it, but because she made them want to. She gave birth to children, some of whom would not survive infancy, and bore her losses without public grief. The court admired her composure. Privately, she mourned in silence, her sorrow folded neatly like the imperial garments she wore. Her strength was not the kind sung by bards or carved into monuments. It was the strength of endurance, of duty fulfilled without complaint, of dignity maintained even in private despair. As Honglich approached the threshold of becoming emperor, Lady Fuca prepared for a transformation of her own. Not of title, but of burden. Becoming empress consort would not be a reward, but a calling, one that would place her at the fulcrum of an empire. While others imagined crowns of jade and robes lined with white fox fur, she saw instead the invisible weight of tradition, the endless tides of court politics, and the fragile balance between mercy and order. In the final months before the Yongjing emperor's death, the imperial court buzzed with tension. Succession was never a simple matter in the Qing dynasty. Although Honglich had long been the favorite, nothing was certain until the moment it was. And when that moment came, When the official edict named him heir and the forbidden city reshaped itself to accommodate a new son of heaven, Lady Fuca did not weep or rejoice. She merely bowed her head, knowing that the true labor of a lifetime was about to begin. She was 21 years old. The day her husband ascended the throne as the Qianlong emperor, Lady Fuca became empress. There was no explosion of celebration, no parade of triumph. Instead, there was order, ritual, and a quiet nod of acknowledgement between two people who understood that power, real power, was never loud. Yet long before her coronation, Lady Fuca had already begun shaping the moral and psychological climate in which her husband would rule. She was the unmovable center around which the future emperor could orbit without fear of betrayal. Her presence allowed him to be bold in policy, knowing that the fortress of his household was impenetrable. She was his compass when ambition threatened to tilt toward excess, his conscience when flattery blurred truth. In every way that mattered. She had already been empress long before the empire recognized her as such. The rise of Fuca was not a tale of conquest, but of constancy. Not of passion, but of precision. And in a world where dynasties crumbled not from war but from within, it was her silent mastery of the domestic sphere, her ability to stabilize the unseen, that made her indispensable. Her strength lay not in what she controlled, but in what she held together. This was not a woman made for legend, but for legacy. And the legacy she would leave behind would echo not through songs, but through the silent halls of the Forbidden City long after her footsteps had faded from its red-lacquered floors. For now, the empire was awakening. The Qianlong era was about to begin, and standing behind its golden curtain was a woman the world would scarcely see, but whose influence it would feel for generations. The Forbidden City was a city within a city, a labyrinth of ritual and hierarchy where every step had meaning, every glance held consequence, and every silence could echo louder than any declaration. For the newly enthroned Qianlong emperor, the task of ruling an empire was not merely the art of governance. It was the maintenance of illusion, tradition, and control. And in this delicate choreography of dynasty and image, the presence of one woman anchored the throne in ways no edict could. Empress Xiaoxianchun, formerly Lady Fuca, understood instinctively that power within the Qing court was more often wielded behind silk screens than on imperial thrones. Now Empress consort in name, her influence remained as it had always been, quiet, unseen, and absolute. She did not change her demeanor after the coronation. The soft gait, the unyielding posture, the carefully measured words, everything remained constant. But beneath the still surface, her responsibilities had deepened immeasurably. She was now the head of the inner court, the guardian of all that lay beyond the dragon throne, an empire within an empire. Her dominion was not over generals or ministers, but over rituals, lineage, and the moral fabric of the imperial household. Every consort, every concubine, every servant girl now answered to her. The balance of favor and rivalry, of affection and protocol, fell within her jurisdiction. But what distinguished Empress Xiaoxianchun was not her title nor her command over others. It was the discipline she imposed first and foremost upon herself. While other women in the palace might have taken the opportunity to assert their status, she did the opposite. She receded further from spectacle, immersing herself in the labor of order. She oversaw the daily rituals of the harem with a precision more akin to military command than domestic stewardship. Morning greetings, dietary restrictions, childbirth ceremonies, mourning periods all passed through her scrutiny. Her decrees were not loud, but they were final. To disobey the empress was to disrupt the sanctity of the dynasty's bloodline. Yet she remained, as ever, an enigma. She spoke rarely and punished even more rarely. But her disapproval, delivered with a subtle tightening of the eyes or the mere delay of an invitation, could unravel a consort's standing in weeks. Her composure was such that even in moments of scandal or unexpected death, she responded with the same cool precision as in times of celebration. The emperor noticed. More than that, he relied on it. Qianlong, newly ascended and under the weight of expectation from his father's stern legacy and grandfather's expansive reign, often found himself retreating to her quarters not for affection, but for calibration. In a court full of voices telling him what he wanted to hear, she remained the one who told him nothing, offering instead the silence from which he could extract clarity. He never questioned her loyalty because she never performed it. It was simply part of her being. as he began the early reforms of his reign, tightening tax structures, reorganizing provincial administrations and commissioning vast cultural projects. He did so with the confidence that the heart of his empire was intact. That heart was her. While he presided over memorials in Mandarin and Manchu, she presided over the rhythm of life behind palace walls. The imperial children, too, were drawn into her orbit. Though not all born of her womb, they received her guidance as if they were. She treated them with the same blend of warmth and distance that marked her every interaction. She taught them the rules before affection, discipline before desire. And even as several of them perished young, their brief lives were marked by the order she imposed, lives carried out within structures so refined that even grief had a place and a protocol. Her own children bore the mark of her influence most clearly. The eldest son, a child of great promise, was groomed with strict discipline, taught not to revel in his status but to master its burdens. But fate would not allow him to carry that promise forward. He died young, a tragedy that left the imperial couple raw with private anguish. Still, the empress did not retreat into despair. She continued her work, her ceremonies, her instructions. She did not demand that her pain be shared. It was merely folded into the daily fabric of her duty. Within the larger architecture of Qing rule, she became something more than an empress. She became the moral standard against which other women were measured. Her conduct was copied, her habits emulated, her opinions feared. No decree was needed to affirm her position. She had become the center of gravity in the palace, so stable that the entire structure leaned upon her. Her greatest influence, however, was not in what she did, but in what she prevented. The Qing dynasty had long suffered from the hidden wars of the harem, ambitious consorts, scheming mothers-in-law, eunuchs loyal to their own interests. These silent, internal rivalries had the power to unravel the legitimacy of emperors. But under Empress Xiaoxianchun, those fires never took hold. Not because the court lacked ambition, but because she denied it oxygen. She had no favorites and she made no enemies. Even those who disliked her could find no grounds to challenge her. She left no trace of impropriety. Every gift she accepted was catalogued, every appointment she approved documented. No scandal could cling to her because she gave scandal no surface to attach to. The beauty of her strategy was in its simplicity. By offering nothing personal, she made herself invulnerable. This detachment extended even to her relationship with the emperor. There was affection. Yes, but it was never romanticized. She did not indulge in flirtation, did not compete with concubines for his attention, did not seek to monopolize his affection. In doing so, she ensured that the emperor always returned to her willingly, not out of obligation, but out of balance. She was not his joy, she was his equilibrium. In this, she reflected an understanding of power rarely seen in any era. She knew that the most enduring authority is that which makes itself indispensable without being visible. She knew that love is fleeting, but trust, once forged in the crucible of shared burdens, becomes unbreakable. And so she endured. Through the first years of reform, through floods and famines, through rebellions and palace intrigues, Empress Xiaoxianchun remained where she had always been. Behind the curtain, unseen by the public, but seen always by the emperor. Her name was rarely spoken outside the inner court, but her influence was felt in every edict that bore the emperor's seal. She became, in effect, the shadow architect of the early Qianlong era. While ministers debated and generals marched, while poets composed and scholars compiled, she wove the invisible web of stability that made their work possible. In her silence, she became the framework of order. In her discipline, she became the breath of continuity. No monument would be raised in her honor. No official biography would capture her daily labors. But in the structure of an empire that held together in its most vulnerable years, she was present in every detail. She was not the voice of history, but its heartbeat. And as Qianlong's power solidified, as the empire began to stretch farther than ever before, the world would see the glories of a golden age without ever knowing the woman who made its beginning possible. Behind the silks, behind the rituals, behind the emperor himself, she stood, unwavering. The consort behind the curtain. In the vast ritual theater that was the Qing dynasty, few titles carried as much gravity and as little personal triumph as that of empress. To the outside world, it was a coronation, a recognition of supremacy, dignity, and favor. But for Fuca, it was a mantle that weighed not on her shoulders but on her soul. When she was officially enthroned as Empress Consort of the Qianlong Emperor, it was not a celebration of ascendancy but a deepening of responsibility. The crown she received did not lift her above the rest. It bound her more tightly to the invisible architecture of imperial restraint. Her investiture was dignified, as tradition demanded, but devoid of spectacle. There were no lavish parades, no indulgent displays of affection from the emperor, no grand declarations of love or victory. The ceremony followed the ancient rites with almost mathematical precision, each bow measured, each offering placed with silent care. She stood in her robes of woven gold, her hair adorned with the phoenix diadem that marked her as mother of the nation, her face composed into an expression not of joy but of resolve. The moment passed with solemn grandeur, and the court resumed its rhythm as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Now, she was not merely a consort of discipline, she was the embodiment of imperial womanhood. Her life no longer belonged to herself, nor to her husband, nor even to her children. It belonged to the dynasty, to the spirits of ancestors, to the invisible expectations of 1,000 years of empire. Every glance, every word, every silence had the potential to define the character of a reign. As Empress, Xiaoxianchun governed not with decree but with atmosphere. Her chambers became the epicenter of propriety. The floors were always immaculate, the air always fragrant but never overwhelming. The decor always elegant but never ostentatious. Everything existed in a state of cultivated harmony, a physical manifestation of her internal rigor. Visitors, even those of high rank, unconsciously adjusted their posture in her presence. Their voices softened, their eyes lowered. She altered the psychology of the palace simply by existing within it. Her daily routine was relentless. She awoke before dawn, performed the ceremonial greetings to ancestors, supervised the preparation of offerings, reviewed the schedules of her attendants, received reports on the condition of the palace women, and mediated disputes with calm finality. She ate sparingly, rested minimally, and never indulged in luxuries that could not be justified by tradition. In a court where excess was both temptation and trap, she modeled a kind of imperial asceticism that whispered louder than any sermon. She was not beloved in the way that poets might describe. She did not charm or inspire reverie. But she was respected, profoundly, immovably respected. Her moral authority eclipsed even her ceremonial authority. Ministers whispered that the emperor could not make a decision of consequence without seeking her quiet approval. Eunuchs who served both inner and outer courts understood that an idle comment from the empress could set or still entire currents of influence. But her power was never explicit. She never involved herself in state policy, never summoned ministers or issued advisories. Instead, her influence manifested in the tone of the court. When her restraint was at its most visible, corruption receded. When her standards were most rigorously observed, rivalry softened. It was not that she suppressed ambition, but that she made it clear that ambition must wear the garments of honor and dignity if it hoped to be entertained. Her relationship with the emperor remained unchanged in its essence. They were never ostentatiously affectionate, never publicly tender. Yet Qianlong's gaze lingered longer on her than on any other woman. His letters to her, though rare, carried an intimacy reserved for equals. He trusted her not because she demanded it, but because she never gave him reason to doubt. In a world of illusions and performances, she was the one reality he could anchor to. And he needed that anchor more than ever. The early years of his reign were filled with challenges. The machinery of empire was vast, but rusting at its edges. Local officials bribed their way into appointments, the treasury strained under ceremonial excesses inherited from previous reigns. Border regions grew restless with imperial oversight. While Qianlong worked to restore order with sweeping administrative reforms, he required stability within the forbidden city to focus outward. Xiaoxianchun provided that stability with an unflinching constancy. She managed the complex network of palace women, consorts of various ranks, mothers of imperial children, widows of former emperors, with such quiet efficiency that tensions never reached the surface. While in many dynasties the death of an emperor had meant decades of infighting among his women, under Xiaoxianchun the old order found peace, the new one found place, and harmony reigned where conflict had once festered. Even childbirth The most perilous and politically volatile element of palace life became a domain of order under her watch. She ensured that expectant mothers received equal treatment, regardless of their favor with the emperor. She protected the integrity of medical practices, forbade the interference of personal agendas in the selection of wet nurses or midwives, and ensured that no child was elevated or discarded due to the whim of palace factions. In doing so, she preserved not only the health of the children, but the legitimacy of the line. Tragedy, however, was not a stranger to her chambers. Of the children born to her, several died in infancy or early childhood. These were wounds that no title could protect her from. But even in grief, she modeled composure. She allowed herself mourning but never collapse. She continued to perform her duties with the same vigilance, her eyes dimmed but her spine unbowed. The court observed and learned that dignity was not the absence of sorrow but the discipline to contain it. Her example extended beyond the palace walls. The empress became a symbol in the broader empire, a representation of Manchu virtue, of Confucian womanhood, of imperial balance. In provincial temples and aristocratic households, portraits of her began to appear, not in the tradition of deities or conquerors, but as visual lessons in female rectitude. Her face, composed and firm, became a quiet presence across the nation. Even foreign emissaries, rarely granted insight into the workings of the inner court, heard her name spoken with reverence. They saw in Qianlong a ruler of great command and charisma, but they sensed, sometimes without knowing why, that his court did not descend into the theatrical instability that plagued other dynasties. The reason was always her. She was never called the power behind the throne. That title belonged to schemers and manipulators. She was something rarer, more essential, the conscience of the throne. And yet, as her influence grew, so did the quiet cost of her position. Her body began to falter. The long hours, the unrelenting expectations, the constant mental strain, none of these left visible scars. But they wore her down in increments. Physicians advised rest, she declined. The emperor, though concerned, respected her autonomy too much to impose his will. She insisted on fulfilling her obligations. She did not believe in substitutes for duty. She knew even then that her time might be short. But she did not retreat. She did not diminish. If anything, her presence became more concentrated, her efforts more meticulous. She tightened the ropes of court protocol, eliminated excesses, codified rituals that had once relied on memory and tradition. She began composing her own records of ceremony, not memoirs, not reflections, but guides, so that those who came after her would not stumble in ignorance. It was an act of love, not for herself, but for the dynasty. In her final years as reigning empress, she became a figure almost mythic in her steadiness. Ministers noted that when conflicts erupted in the outer court, the emperor would visit her chambers and emerge with a softened expression. Palace women, when uncertain of conduct, would invoke her name as a form of moral compass. She was not feared, not adored, but she was obeyed, trusted, and remembered. And when the time would come for her to depart from this world, it would be as she had lived, without drama, without indulgence, without fear. But that was still to come. For now she remained the sovereign of silence, the empress crowned not in triumph but in transcendence. Her legacy was not built in stone or gold, but in every moment of peace that allowed the Qianlong emperor to reign without chaos at his back. She was the still point of a spinning world, the pause between decrees, the breath before empire. Crowned in silence, she reigned with a power no enemy could challenge, because no one could take from her what she had never claimed for herself. The Forbidden City had seen sorrow before. Its stones were saturated with centuries of silent grief, with tears hidden behind lacquered doors and weeping confined to brocade pillows. But when Empress Xiaoxianchun mourned, she did so not in the grand tradition of wailing or ritualistic collapse. Her sorrow, like everything else about her, was precise, measured, and invisible to those not trained to see its weight. She had known loss before, children who did not survive infancy, illnesses that crept silently into young bodies, and futures extinguished before they had time to cast shadows. But the death of her second son, Yonglian, the crown prince whom the emperor had held in secret favor, tore through her carefully constructed world with a quiet ferocity that left no room for collapse. Yonglian had been born in the 9th year of Qianlong's reign. From the outset, He had been everything an emperor could desire: intelligent, reserved, diligent. The child mirrored the discipline of his mother and the ambition of his father. He learned quickly, spoke little, and carried himself with an uncanny grace that made ministers bow with sincere deference, even when he was still a boy. Though the emperor had not declared him heir publicly, he had already begun quietly grooming him for succession, and Xiaoxianchun, while never openly indulgent, held the child in a rare space of warmth. But fate does not bargain with order. At the age of 9, Yonglian fell ill. What began as a fever soon bloomed into a relentless decline. The physicians of the inner court administered tinctures, prayers were offered in ancestral temples, and rituals were performed with increasing desperation. The emperor, whose composure in crisis was renowned, became uncharacteristically agitated. But it was Xiaoxianchun who watched the boy's breath falter with a calm that frightened even the attendants. She did not plead. She did not rage. She sat beside his bed, holding his hand with a grip that was neither tight nor trembling, and when the light in his eyes dimmed to memory, she simply closed them with her fingers, then stood and began organizing the burial rites herself. The death of a prince is a national affair, but this one was shrouded in silence, because Yonglian had never been officially named heir. The announcement of his death came to the court as the loss of a beloved son, not a crown prince. Only those closest to the throne understood the true magnitude of the loss and the danger it posed. Imperial succession was never a matter of emotion. It was a matter of survival. A favorite son's death, if mishandled, could shatter alliances, encourage dissent, and awaken dormant factions within the court. Qianlong, who had spent a decade building a stable foundation for Yonglian's future ascension, now found himself staring into a void. But instead of panicking, he turned to the person who had always been the still point in his storm, the Empress. Xiaoxianchun did not retreat from her duties. In the weeks following Yonglian's death, she doubled her attention to the rituals of the court. She ensured that mourning practices were observed without deviation, that no consort or concubine attempted to leverage the tragedy for favor, that the emperor's grief was reflected in the comportment of every woman under her supervision. She transformed her personal devastation into institutional discipline. The court noticed. Never before had a maternal figure absorbed such loss without faltering. Never before had an empress preserved the sanctity of the inner court while grieving her own child. Her strength was not performative. It was relentless, unbreakable, terrifying in its purity. But the price of that control was immense. She began to fade. It was not sudden. There were no dramatic faintings, no proclamations of weakness. It was a slow erosion. Days when she remained in her chambers longer than usual, meals left untouched, silences that stretched just a little too long. The emperor, attentive as always, noticed the shifts. He offered moments of respite, but she declined them. He suggested delegating certain rituals to senior consorts. She refused. She believed that duty was not something to be passed along like a robe. It had to be worn regardless of weight. In private, she wept only once, and only in the presence of her closest attendant, a woman who had served her since girlhood. Even then, her tears were silent, her body rigid as if even her grief demanded posture. The attendant later recalled that the empress had whispered only one phrase: "He carried our virtues." Then she wiped her face, stood, and resumed her duties as though she had merely paused for breath. The loss of Yonglian also signaled something else to the emperor, a shift in the moral order of his reign. Qianlong had always viewed his empire as a living organism, one whose health depended not only on armies and tax codes, but on balance between yin and yang, tradition and reform, hierarchy and grace. Xiaoxianchun had been his instrument of that balance. With her managing the intricate network of familial and ceremonial ties, he had been free to project imperial might outward. But with her inner world beginning to crack, he found the edges of his empire more difficult to hold. The emperor did not grieve like other men. He painted, composed verses, commissioned commemorative jade figurines. In his poems, Yonglian became a phoenix who flew too soon, a flame extinguished by heaven's jealousy. But behind those poetic laments was something more brutal, a sense of fragility, of the limits even emperors must bow to. And Xiaoxianchun, in her unflinching silence, became the embodiment of that limit. As the years passed, she continued to maintain the palace order with the same diligence. but those closest to her noticed that she no longer walked as quickly. Her handwriting, once pristine, began to show signs of fatigue. The glow of her skin dimmed. The tone of her voice softened, not with kindness, but with exhaustion. Her strength remained intact, but it no longer radiated outward. It was contained, compressed, as if she had begun to preserve what remained for a final act. Still, she would not relinquish control. She ensured the elevation of certain women in the harem who had proven themselves loyal, strategically placing them where they could maintain the tone of the court should her own influence wane. She commissioned updated codes of conduct, refined temple rituals, simplified some burdensome traditions to allow her successors a better path. She was not sentimental. She was preparing. And yet, no preparation could fully replace what she embodied. The emperor knew this. The court knew this. Even the women she had elevated knew it. There would be others to wear the phoenix crown, but none would be her. She was not just empress. She was balance incarnate. And without her, even the most orderly palace would tilt toward chaos. One final act of service, however, remained. When a new consort gave birth to a healthy son, one who would later ascend the throne as the Qing emperor, Xiaoxianchun visited the mother personally. She brought gifts, offered instructions on rearing, and ensured that the child would be raised in the tradition of duty before desire. It was not her child, and it would not carry her bloodline forward, but it would carry her values. In that moment, she showed that her devotion was not to lineage, but to the dynasty itself. The blood she had shed, the grief she had swallowed, the balance she had preserved, all of it had been for something greater than personal legacy. It had been for continuity, for order, for the fragile architecture of empire. And though the court would never see her cry again, and the world outside would never know her heartache, the halls of the Forbidden City would remember. Every polished stone she walked across, every incense burner she lit, every scroll she annotated became a relic of discipline and loss. Balance, she had once believed, was the highest form of love, and in the quiet aftermath of her tragedy, she proved it, not by surviving the storm, but by ensuring that no one else felt its full force. By the 23rd year of Qianlong's reign, the empire stood at the zenith of its majesty. Borders were secure, the treasury overflowed with silver, and the arts flourished with a brilliance not seen since the heights of the Tang. Painters, poets, and scholars competed for imperial favor, while governors across the realm sent tributes more symbolic than necessary, more ritual than pragmatic. It was, by all outward signs, a golden age, and to commemorate it, the emperor announced a southern tour, a grand imperial procession through the heartlands of Jiangnan, the cultural and economic engine of China. It would be Qianlong's fourth tour of the south, but unlike the earlier ones, this time he would not travel alone. He would be accompanied by the empress. It was not customary. Traditionally, emperors traveled light, unburdened by the intricacies of harem politics or the demands of protocol that followed an empress. But this tour was meant to be both spectacle and symbol, a declaration not just of power, but of harmony. To bring the empress along was to display the moral center of the dynasty to the wealthiest and most literate subjects of the empire. It was an act of profound political theater, carefully orchestrated and deeply personal. Empress Xiaoxianchun accepted without hesitation, though her body was already beginning to falter in ways she did not speak of. Preparations consumed the capital for months. Routes were cleaned and lined with banners bearing classical verse. Officials built temporary palaces in key cities, each more elaborate than the last. Artisans worked day and night to craft gifts suitable for an imperial presence. And when the procession finally departed from the Forbidden City, it was less a caravan than a moving court, hundreds of carriages, guards, servants, musicians, and scholars stretching for miles across the countryside. Through Hebei, through Shandong, through the great river valleys they traveled, passing fields of ripening grain and towns where the people bowed so low their foreheads kissed the dirt. At every stop, the emperor received poems composed in his honor, calligraphy from famous scholars, lacquerware from guild masters, and by his side, always composed, always silent, always poised, sat the empress, her eyes calm, her presence dignified. She did not speak often during the journey, but when she did, it was to inquire about the conditions of local women, the education of girls, the religious practices observed in temples far from the capital. She listened to dialects with a curiosity that masked her exhaustion. And when she smiled rarely, it carried the weight of genuine grace. In Suzhou, she walked the stone paths of classical gardens that mirrored the balance she had spent a lifetime cultivating. In Hangzhou, she ascended the terraces overlooking West Lake and gazed upon waters that shimmered like a painting come to life. In each place, she received gifts not just of material luxury, but of sentiment: silken scrolls painted with plum blossoms, embroidered fans bearing verses of restraint and virtue. Everywhere she went, the people whispered of her elegance, her serenity, her distant beauty. They did not see the moments between appearances, when she leaned a little more heavily on her attendants, when she closed her eyes for seconds too long, when her breath came shallow and her voice fell to a whisper. Illness had become her secret companion. No one knew when it began, perhaps even she did not. It had been creeping for years, cloaked beneath the discipline that defined her. The fatigue that no longer lifted with rest, the appetite that vanished like incense smoke, the shivers that came even under the summer sun. She had always believed in the body as an instrument of duty, a vessel to be managed and silenced. And so she had ignored the signs, even as they grew more persistent. But the southern heat, the humidity that clung like damp silk, began to erode what little resistance she had left. By the time the procession reached Wuxi, she could no longer conceal it. Physicians were summoned discreetly, their diagnoses cloaked in euphemism and deference. They offered tonics, rest, prayers. But they knew. The emperor knew. And perhaps she knew before any of them. Yet the tour continued. For Qianlong, the presence of his empress had become inseparable from the narrative he was crafting for his reign. She was not merely his consort. She was the embodiment of the harmony he claimed to govern with. To cut the tour short would be to admit fragility, not just of the body, but of the dynasty's center. And so he pressed on, carefully managing appearances, ensuring that wherever she could not go, her image, on banners, in paintings, in ritual, would still be present. In Nanjing, she appeared for one final public ceremony, a blessing at a Confucian temple restored under imperial patronage. Draped in pale silk, her face pale yet composed, she moved with a slowness that was almost sacred. Observers, none knowing the truth, saw only majesty. In truth, it was the last time she would stand unaided. The return to Beijing was slower. The procession's grandeur receded. The trumpets quieted. The drums fell still. And within the carriage, at the heart of the silent court on wheels, the empress lay in rest, her breath shallow, her fingers curled around a hand scroll of verses composed during the journey. Lines she would never finish annotating. Back in the Forbidden City, her decline accelerated. She was confined to her chambers, surrounded by the soft sounds of women who knew not to cry, of eunuchs who moved like shadows, of physicians who offered hope in tones already resigned. The emperor visited daily, sometimes twice. He sat by her side in silence, his hand resting atop hers, unmoving. He did not speak to her of politics, or of ritual, or of succession. There was nothing left to be said. They had always spoken more in silence than in words. She died on the 8th day of the 7th month in the 25th year of his reign. No edict could convey what her death meant. The court declared a period of mourning, but no decree captured the void that followed. The emperor wept not publicly, but with the weight of a man who had lost not only his partner but the invisible architecture of his rule. His poems from that season bore none of the flourish for which he was known. They were stark, unadorned, aching. He compared her to a plum blossom frost could not wither, to a lantern that burned even after oil had run dry. He refused to appoint a new empress for years. He ensured that Xiaoxianchun's name would be etched into the annals with honor. Empress Xiaoxianchun, meaning filial, virtuous, pure. He ordered that she be buried with full imperial rites and that her tomb be constructed alongside the one he planned for himself, though he would live many decades more. He had already chosen eternity beside her. For the women of the palace, her death marked the end of an era. Discipline gave way to rivalry. The structure she had upheld began to tremble at its edges. The emperor, now more withdrawn, began to rely increasingly on others, chiefly Hashan, whose eventual corruption would cast a long shadow. But even in that, the absence of the empress was felt, not just as loss but as consequence. The southern tour had been meant as a declaration of glory. In the end, it became a farewell. What she left behind was not legacy in the conventional sense. She wrote no memoirs, left no manifestos. But the empire she helped stabilize endured. The children she disciplined ruled with caution. The rituals she refined became law. And the emperor she stood beside would never again find in any woman the balance she had provided. In the heart of the Forbidden City, beneath vermilion beams and gold-tiled roofs, the silence of her absence was louder than the music of celebration. The tour had shown the world the empire's splendor. Her death revealed its soul. The palace did not change overnight, but its silence did. It was no longer the serene stillness of discipline and order, it became the hollow quiet of something lost and irretrievable. After Empress Xiaoxianchun's death, the Forbidden City, though unchanged in stone and ritual, felt emptied of its axis. The woman who had defined its rhythm, who had calibrated its pulse with the precision of breath and duty, was gone. And with her passing, the fragile equilibrium she had sustained began to tremble, not with noise, but with the subtle tremors of uncertainty. The emperor mourned, not in the manner expected of a sovereign, but in a way that shook the core of those who knew him best. He, who had always embodied the Confucian ideal of composure, now moved like a man bearing weight without structure. His gaze, once sharp with deliberation, now lingered unfocused on walls she once passed, on gardens she once strolled through, on the empty seat beside him at morning court. He had ordered the nation into mourning as was required. Black silks replaced red in the halls, and songs of celebration were silenced by edict. But these acts, though grand in scope, did not touch the space where his grief lived. That space was private, unreachable, and all-consuming. He spent long hours in her private quarters, now preserved exactly as she had left them. Her brushes still rested in their porcelain stand. Her favorite texts remained open on their last-read pages. Her inkstones had dried mid-thought. The attendants had been instructed not to alter a thing. The emperor would come, sometimes daily, sometimes in the middle of the night, and sit. He spoke rarely, but when he did, it was often to himself, reciting fragments of her advice, her corrections, her soft rebukes. His poems from this period, later collected by scholars, abandoned metaphor. They spoke directly of her restraint, her elegance, her silence that had once made his world feel full. But outside the inner chambers, the machinery of empire could not pause. Ministers came, petitions arrived, provincial matters required attention. The emperor resumed his duties. But his decisions grew more opaque. Where once he had sought balance, he now sought distraction. He surrounded himself with beauty, with painters, poets, artisans whose creations could momentarily mask the ache that structure alone could no longer soothe. And into this void others stepped. The harmony that had once defined the inner court began to unravel. Without the empress's hand to temper ambition, rivalries among consorts, long held at bay by her presence, found air to breathe. Women once content to serve their roles began maneuvering for elevation, for favor, for legacy. Whispered criticisms emerged, alliances were formed in shadows. The strict lines of conduct she had upheld softened, then blurred. The emperor, for all his power, did not or could not intervene in the way she had. He noticed, certainly, but perhaps he no longer had the will. The anchor of his moral compass had been removed, and without her to govern the private realm, he allowed the tides to shift. Slowly, subtly, the integrity of the court she had curated gave way to something looser, less defined. In time, Qianlong named a new empress. It was an act of necessity, not of affection. Nalapti. The chosen successor possessed none of Xiaoxianchun's restraint. She was capable, ambitious, but lacked the humility and subtlety that had made her predecessor so revered. Her ascent did not bring stability, it brought tension. The court sensed the shift. Though she held the title, she did not command the deference that had once surrounded Xiaoxianchun like a natural aura. And the emperor did not love her. That truth, though never spoken, was understood by all. The relationship between Qianlong and his new empress was marked by distance, by unmet expectations, by a lingering comparison that no living woman could surpass. Nalapti, aware of the void she could not fill, became embittered. Her behavior grew erratic. Rumors circulated of confrontations, of broken ritual, of emotional instability. She began withdrawing from ceremonial duties, then from the emperor himself. Eventually, Qianlong stripped her of titles, privileges, and honors. She died in disgrace and, unlike Xiaoxianchun, was denied the rights of joint burial. It was not merely a political demotion, it was a declaration. The emperor had consecrated the memory of his first empress in silence, and in so doing, made all who followed unworthy by comparison. Even Hashan, the courtier who would rise to unparalleled influence in the later years of Qianlong's reign, was in some sense a symptom of her absence. The emperor, once guarded in whom he allowed close, now filled his court with flatterers, with men who praised without question. Hashan was brilliant and charming, but also unscrupulous. And as Qianlong aged, he relied more heavily on him, perhaps seeking in Hashan the clarity that had once come so easily when he had spoken with her. But Hashan was not Xiaoxianchun. No one was. The empire continued, of course. Its borders held, its economy flourished, its arts dazzled. On the surface, the Qianlong era remained golden. But beneath, the balance had shifted. Corruption seeped into lower offices. Ritual became performance. The harmony that had once united palace and people began to fray, not in crisis, but in drift. And through it all, Qianlong kept returning to her memory. Each year, on the anniversary of her death, he composed new verses. He ensured that her tomb remained unmarred by neglect. He forbade any of his successors from disturbing her legacy. He instructed that she be remembered not merely as a consort, but as a sovereign of virtue. And though he never again found her reflection in a living companion, he saw her everywhere, in the lines of his calligraphy, in the rules she had once enforced, in the very structure of the palace she had kept whole, in the vast annals of imperial history, where women were often reduced to names and titles. Xiaoxianchun became something more. She was not just a chapter, she was the grammar, the structure beneath the prose, the silence that gave meaning to the noise. Her death was not a moment. It was a slow unraveling, a shift so subtle that the empire itself did not feel it until it was too late. And for the man who had once ruled the world with her by his side, the throne, though unshaken in gold and jade, grew lonelier with each passing year, not because of the burden of rule, but because the one who had made ruling bearable was gone. The throne itself remained unmoved, its golden dragons coiled in eternal vigilance, its lacquered platform unscathed by time. Yet to those who watched closely, it no longer commanded the same sense of certainty. The man who sat upon it still bore the name of Son of Heaven, still received envoys with unshakable dignity, still ruled over an empire at its peak. But something within the man had shifted, something fundamental, invisible, and irreversible. The silence once filled by the voice that never spoke too loudly, the presence that never demanded, was now empty, and the weight of that absence pressed harder than the burden of the crown itself. After Empress Xiaoxianchun's death, the halls of the Forbidden City continued to echo with protocol and pageantry. But the resonance had changed. Ceremonies unfolded with clockwork efficiency. But the soul of those rituals, the breath behind the words, the restraint behind the flourish, had vanished. The court moved as before, yet no longer moved as one. The empress had been more than a figurehead. She had been the unseen equilibrium between decorum and desire, between authority and affection, between duty and indulgence. In her absence, the palace began to drift not into chaos but into something more insidious, indifference. Qianlong, though still commanding, began to rule in gradients of detachment. His once meticulous attention to the moral character of the court softened. Decisions that had once passed through rigorous layers of reflection were now made swiftly, sometimes impulsively. He surrounded himself with art, poetry, collections of antiquity, layers of beauty behind which he hid the growing hollowness. The scholar-emperor remained, but beneath his calligraphy and verse, there was grief unresolved, and longing without anchor. The harem, once a sphere of graceful hierarchy, began to tilt under the weight of ambition long held in check. With no empress to enforce the unspoken codes, rivalries reawakened. Petty offenses became pointed gestures. Compliments began to carry blades. Senior consorts who had once bowed instinctively to Xiaoxianchun now jostled for influence, masking their aspirations with performances of humility that deceived no one. Where the empress had ruled by moral force, by the strength of what she did not say, her successors ruled by volume, by favors, schemes, and visible proximity to the emperor. Nalapti, the woman who would later be named second empress, entered this atmosphere with the burden of expectation and the inevitability of failure. She was not cruel, nor was she incapable. but she lacked the delicate architecture of inner strength and invisible command that Xiaoxianchun had woven through years of devotion. Her temperament leaned toward assertion, her style toward control, and in the palace that still whispered the memory of quiet balance, she became a discordant note. Her relationship with Qianlong never matured into trust. He had not married her for love, nor even for necessity, but from the pressure of protocol. An emperor without an empress raised questions. A palace without a matron invited instability. And so she was installed not as successor in spirit but as a placeholder in form. It was a position impossible to fulfill. In time, friction grew. Na Lap's attempts to assert authority clashed with the unspoken traditions that Xiaoxianchun had left behind. Her manner, seen by some as decisive, was seen by others as abrasive. She dismissed long-serving attendants, challenged established customs, and withdrew from certain rituals altogether. The palace, sensitive to the smallest shifts in tone, began to resist. Whispers spread. Dissent took root not in open rebellion but in eyes lowered with just enough delay to be noticed. The emperor, still grieving, observed it all with a kind of weary tolerance. He made no move to intervene, neither in defense nor in condemnation. When Na Lap withdrew from ceremonial duties, he allowed it. When she ceased joining court gatherings, he did not call her back. And when rumors began to circle of her isolation, her bitterness, her alleged confrontations with other consorts, he remained silent. But silence, once the language of harmony, had become the sound of abandonment. Eventually, Na Lap was stripped of her honors. She died in obscurity, uncelebrated, her tomb separate from the imperial lineage. It was not punishment. It was disassociation. Qianlong would not allow her memory to infringe upon the sanctity of Xiaoxianchun's legacy. No other woman, in life or in death, would share the space once held by his first empress, not in the halls of memory, nor in the chambers of eternity. Yet even as he protected her memory, the emperor himself began to drift further from the moral clarity she had once embodied. The entrance of Hashan into his inner circle marked a new era, not of collapse, but of concession. Hashan was brilliant, charismatic, and utterly unscrupulous. He flattered with precision, anticipated the emperor's moods, provided solutions before problems could be named. And in Qianlong's advancing age, surrounded by memories too sharp to bear and successors too distant to trust, he became the voice the emperor leaned on. What Xiaoxianchun had once balanced with silence, Hashan filled with spectacle. Under his influence, the palace grew more extravagant. Ceremonial spending increased. Appointments became favors. Laws began to bend at the edges. Qianlong, perhaps willfully, allowed it. Perhaps he believed that beauty could substitute for virtue. Or perhaps he simply no longer had the will to enforce what she had once ensured. The people still revered him. He was, after all, the emperor who had brought peace and wealth. His verses adorned temples. His portraits lined provincial halls. His military campaigns, though fewer, remained decisive. But within the palace, the truth was plainer. The moral heart of the empire had ceased to beat when she had breathed her last. In his later writings, Qianlong returned again and again to her image. Not her physical beauty, which he rarely described, but her presence, her eyes that missed nothing, her voice that never needed to rise, her understanding of duty that surpassed even his. He wrote of her not as a companion, but as a guide, a mirror, the one person before whom he had never needed to pretend. No new empress was ever named after Na Lap. Qianlong would outlive them all. And when he finally stepped down, formally abdicating to his son, though retaining power as retired emperor, it was not an act of humility but of exhaustion. The throne he had once ruled from with such precision no longer held its meaning. It had become a symbol disconnected from its spirit. In the twilight of his reign, he made one final decision that no minister opposed, no scholar critiqued. He ordered that he be buried beside Empress Xiaoxianchun. The tomb had long been prepared. A dual mausoleum carved with images of balance and purity. He left no instructions for a grand epitaph, only that her name be inscribed before his. It was a gesture not of romance, but of reverence. He had ruled an empire, but she had ruled his center. And after her silence, the throne, though occupied, had never truly been filled again. The years that followed Empress Xiaoxianchun's death drifted by like autumn leaves over still water, graceful in their motion, inevitable in their fading. The empire that she had helped to anchor continued to thrive in form, but beneath its gilded surface a subtle emptiness had settled. It was not the absence of wealth, nor of military might, nor of imperial confidence. It was the absence of measure, of harmony, of the quiet moral spine that had once stretched through every corridor of the Forbidden City. It was the absence of her. But though the Empress was no longer physically present, her legacy did not vanish. It simply changed form. Her influence became spectral, woven into the very architecture of court life. Stitched into the scrolls of ceremony she had refined, echoed in the tone of court officials who had once bowed to her example. She had not authored manifestos nor left behind volumes of instruction. But her habits had become habit, her silence a standard. Her restraint, her precision, her equilibrium, these were the inheritances she passed on, not by proclamation, but by having lived them so unwaveringly that they became impossible to forget. In the emperor's private chambers, her memory endured with painful constancy. Though decades passed, he preserved her quarters in pristine condition. No object was removed, no furnishing altered. Her brush remained beside her inkstone. Her favorite scripture, bookmarked by a silk ribbon, remained open on its last page. He instructed that these spaces be cleaned daily, as if expecting her return. None dared question this ritual. It was understood, even among eunuchs and concubines born long after her death, that the Empress lived on, not in body, but in ritual, in atmosphere, in silence. Each year, on the anniversary of her death, Qianlong retreated from public life. He fasted. He wrote. The court understood these absences. Ministers submitted no petitions during these days. Entertainments were suspended. Temple bells rang in her name. It was not merely grief that drove the emperor to this annual ritual, it was devotion. A devotion that time had neither dulled nor diluted. In his poetry, which continued to flow well into his later years, he returned to her again and again. The verses grew sparer, the metaphors simpler. No longer grand proclamations of cosmic sorrow, they became whispers of memory. He compared her not to stars or mountains, but to things smaller and truer. The warmth of morning tea, the fragrance of aged silk, the hush of snow falling on palace roofs. He did not need to say her name. Everyone knew whom he wrote of. No other woman had earned that kind of absence presence. Her absence also came to shape the emperor's judgments. In later years, as corruption crept more visibly into the court, as even trusted ministers began to stretch the boundaries of their roles, Qianlong often reflected not on policy but on the nature of character. He spoke more frequently of virtue, of restraint, of balance, not as lofty ideals but as benchmarks he had once witnessed daily. He would chide officials not with anger but with comparisons. We once had a standard, he would say. She did not raise her voice, and yet the court was never louder. The failure of her successors only deepened her legacy. No woman who followed could replicate the grace with which she had governed the inner court. Some tried with rigor, others with charm. Still others with power, but none succeeded in restoring the harmony that had once radiated from her quarters outward. Even as Qianlong aged, even as he abdicated in name while retaining control in practice, he allowed no empress to be named in her place again. The title, like a room sealed in mourning, was left unoccupied. Among his children and grandchildren, stories of Xiaoxianchun became parables. She was spoken of not in the language of nostalgia, but of guidance. The surviving daughters of the court were taught to model their comportment on her memory. The imperial sons, even those never held by her hand, learned that governance was as much about what one withholds as what one commands. Her shadow shaped generations softly, completely, in ways that even Qianlong himself may not have foreseen. In state rituals, Qianlong ensured that she received precedence in the order of honor. During ancestral sacrifices, her name was the first spoken. Her tablets were placed closest to his. When foreign dignitaries visited the capital and asked of the empress, they were told not of current titles or living figures, but of the woman who had once balanced the empire in her silence. Her legend became curated by the emperor himself, not mythologized in exaggeration, but preserved with such clarity and consistency that even those who had never known her felt they had. Outside the palace, her image began to take on a near-mythic quality. Scholars wrote essays on her virtue. Artists painted her likeness, though many had never seen her in life. They depicted her with a composure that transcended physical beauty. Always modest, always poised, always slightly distant, as if she existed on the edge of the visible world. Temples were dedicated to women of virtue, and in these, Xiaoxianchun's name appeared among the great paragons of imperial womanhood, not canonized by decree but by reputation. Even the architecture of the Qing dynasty bore her imprint. The palace complexes she had influenced, structures of symmetrical design, of corridors built not for grandeur but for grace, remained untouched. Qianlong refused renovations to her quarters, citing perfection does not improve with embellishment. When new wings of the palace were built, he modeled their proportions on the harmony she had once governed, their courtyards constructed to mirror her sense of measured space. Yet perhaps her most profound legacy was not in bricks or ink but in the internal compass she left behind in Qianlong himself. Though he reigned for decades after her death, and lived well into old age, Qianlong never again exhibited the same kind of inner restraint that had once marked his early rule. The emperor of his later years, still powerful, still cultured, grew more indulgent, more susceptible to flattery, more dependent on those who played to his loneliness. Hashan's meteoric rise and unchecked corruption would one day become a cautionary tale in its own right. And yet, Qianlong did not reverse it. He let it continue. Because the one voice that might have tempered him, the one presence that could have anchored his judgment, was no longer there. And so her legacy became not only what she had done, but what failed in her absence. She had been his conscience. And conscience, once externalized into another, does not easily return to the self when that other is gone. As he approached the end of his life, Qianlong made one final affirmation of her place beside him, not only in history, but in eternity. He ordered that the plans for their joint burial be reaffirmed. Her tomb, already constructed with imperial precision, would remain untouched. His own, though still in preparation, would be made to match it, not in grandeur but in symmetry. He insisted that their tombs be aligned in a manner that reflected their earthly partnership. Her name first, her chamber undisturbed, her position honored. To the world, he was the longest reigning emperor in Chinese history, a sovereign of poetry, conquest, and unparalleled cultural refinement. But in the quiet of his last years, in the rituals of remembrance, in the ink-stained scrolls of his final poems, he was something else, a widower haunted not by regret, but by reverence. Her memory outlived her breath. Her silence shaped his voice, and in the shadows of empire, her legacy remained, not blazing, but enduring, like the slow-burning ember of incense long after the flame has vanished. By the time the Qianlong emperor reached his late 80s, the grandeur of his reign had become legend. He had ruled longer than any emperor before him, presided over an empire that stretched farther and gleamed brighter than the world had known China to be in centuries. The Forbidden City remained immaculate, its walls painted with vermilion pride, its courtyards echoing with the precise beat of ritual drums. Yet behind the enduring image of power stood a figure now burdened by memory more than mandate, of a man who had lived too long, ruled too completely, and loved only once with the purity he could never replicate. His abdication in the 60th year of his reign had been symbolic, though he passed the throne to his son. The Jiaqing emperor, he continued to control the true levers of power as the retired emperor, or Taishang Huang. It was not humility that prompted this gesture, but reverence. He had sworn not to surpass the years of his grandfather, the Kangxi emperor, and for all his might, he would not break that filial vow. In that decision, one could still hear echoes of the balance Xiaoxianchun had once maintained within him, restraint as a form of strength. Yet in the final decade of his life, Qianlong's world grew quieter. The great court painters, the calligraphers, the advisors of his youth, many had passed. His children were now old. His grandchildren grew with a formality that reminded him more of governance than of family. The city he had ruled for most of a century remained beautiful, but it no longer pulsed with the same familiarity. Its rituals endured, but they no longer grounded him. He spent more time in reflection than in rule. He would sit in the garden of tranquil longevity, staring at the koi moving slowly beneath the ice of winter, or watching the wisteria bloom for the 50th time along the southern corridor. He recited lines of poetry aloud to no one, his voice rasping into the air as though trying to summon a reply that would never come. In these moments, his thoughts always returned to her. Xiaoxianchun. He did not say her name often. He did not need to. Every object she had touched, every hallway she had walked, every ceremonial phrase she had once corrected in his youth was etched so deeply into the palace that her presence felt embedded in its bones. Even as new concubines were brought forth, women too young to remember her reign, he found no interest in them. They were voices of another generation, one he no longer sought to understand. His interest in beauty, once insatiable in the form of art and literature, narrowed now to memory. He began writing about her in prose. These were not public eulogies, not inscriptions for stone or court. They were letters, though never addressed, never sent. He wrote of the way she used to correct his brushstroke when he practiced calligraphy in private. He wrote of how she always arrived exactly 1 moment before ceremony, never too early to draw attention, never too late to disrupt harmony. He remembered how she never raised her voice, even when grief crushed her chest like iron. And he recalled, with a pang so sharp it never dulled, the scent of sandalwood that clung to her silk even on days of mourning. He wrote because he had no one else left to tell. Even the trusted few who had once served them both had grown old or passed away. The officials who remembered the Empress as a living force were now ancient, their recollections clouded by nostalgia. But his was not nostalgia. His memory of her was precise, undistorted. He did not need to embellish what had already been perfect in its quietness. As his health declined, he began finalizing the details of his tomb, the Yuling, part of the Eastern Qing tombs. It had been in planning for decades, but now it became an obsession. He ordered adjustments to its dimensions, its facing, the placement of the central chamber. Most importantly, he reviewed the arrangements for her tomb, already long completed, and demanded that his final resting place be aligned with hers, not just in geography, but in symbolism. The distance between their 2 burial chambers was measured to mirror the respectful space that had once existed between their thrones. Their spirits, he declared, must rest as they had once ruled, side by side, equal in dignity. He forbade any other woman to be entombed with him. He left instructions that no later empress, not even those posthumously titled, would share her space. Even in death, her position beside him would remain undisturbed. In the final weeks of his life, when his voice weakened and his hands trembled, he asked only to be read the poems he had once written for her. Attendants, unsure of the appropriate tone, read slowly, carefully, often blinking away their own tears. They did not fully understand the world he was leaving, but they could feel the gravity of the one he had lost long ago. Qianlong died in 1799, at the age of 87, having outlived not only his peers, but his own image. His death was marked with the full splendor of Qing tradition, multi-day processions, rites performed at ancestral temples, officials donning white robes of mourning. Across the empire, bells tolled and incense burned. The man who had once unified the realm with his military, his pen, and his patronage of beauty, was sent to rest with every honor the Middle Kingdom could offer. But beneath the ritual, beneath the robes and the red banners edged with gold, his final act was not of empire, but of love. When the gates of the eastern tombs closed behind his funeral cortege, and his spirit was enshrined beside hers in the solemn quiet of Yuling, it was not the grandeur of his reign that defined the moment. It was the reunion of a balance long broken. A tomb for 2. There, beneath centuries of stone and soil, away from the chaos of history and the judgment of dynasties, Qianlong and Xiaoxianchun lay once again in perfect symmetry. He, the emperor of unmatched legacy. She, the empress whose silence had shaped a generation. And though the world above would continue, new emperors, new revolutions, new reckonings, their story endured in the quietest of places. Not in palaces, not in proclamations, but in the space between 2 chambers carved in stillness, bound by discipline, sealed by memory. Where duty became love, where power bowed to grace, where an emperor, at last, came home.